¿Está grabando? Ok. Bueno, bienvenidos. Welcome back. Today, we're going to be speaking about time tenses. This is an important part. Especially the simple present and the simple past. I recommend you starting by those two. Those are two time tenses that we start checking since elementary school, probably. Do you remember the first time that you were checking I don't like, I do like, do you want, she doesn't want? Do you remember that? It must have been 10 years ago, probably even longer. So the thing is, we're going to be checking all time tenses. It's going to be a series of videos. We're not going to cover all of them in one video because it will be extra long. So we're going to start with defining what is a time tense, what a time tense is. So time tenses. It says, the time tenses that we use are shown by the auxiliary. Okay, so we need auxiliaries. The auxiliary is going to tell us the time tense that we are using. It comes after the subject, but before the verbs. Okay, so the auxiliary is not the verb, is not the action that the doer, that the subject is doing. It's just showing the time tense. Every time tense is different in meaning. We use them to communicate different ideas. They can tell us that the action of the sentence is in progress, it is finished, ahead of us, further in the past than other actions, etc. So there are reasons to choose to use the simple present instead of the simple past, the past continuous, the present perfect. I mean, we have like multiple different reasons to change them. We're going to be checking each one of them. We have present, past, and future. And we have them in the simple form, the continuous form, or progressive form, the perfect form, and the perfect continuous or perfect progressive form. In total, we have 12 different time tenses, okay? So this is important. We have 12 time tenses. We have the present, the past, and the future, but we have simple present, simple past, and simple future. Those are three: simple present, simple past, and simple future. We have the present, the past, and the future in the continuous form: present continuous, past continuous, and future continuous. Sometimes the continuous form is also called the progressive form. It is the same thing. It just it depends on the book that you're using. It depends on the teacher that you have. Honestly, you can interchange the names: present continuous, present progressive; past continuous, past progressive; future continuous, future progressive. They are the same pretty much. Then we have the present, the past, and the future, but in perfect form. We have the present perfect, the past perfect, and the future perfect. And finally, we have the perfect continuous, again, or perfect progressive forms. We have present perfect continuous, past perfect continuous, and future perfect continuous. So we have in total 12 time tenses. We're going to be checking all of them and what do they mean and when do we use each one and stuff like that, okay? So we're going to start with the simple present and the simple past. As I was telling you before, these two time tenses are probably the two most difficult ones. They have, we start checking them at the beginning of the course, of every course that you take. If you started in elementary school, in middle school, or whatever, this is something that you have been using for a long time because it is difficult. We start with a simple present because of two reasons. Number one, because we have to start somewhere, and it's very common. I mean, you're gonna find it a lot and you're gonna use it a lot. Number two, and more importantly, because in total, for example, in the university, you have 6 semesters of English. So at least 6 semesters. The program is 8 semesters. So you have 3 to 4 years to learn the language. The problem is, if you start with a simple present on the first semester, you're going to be using it for 3 or 4 years. And this is how long it takes to fully understand it. It is not really that simple. It is the simple present and the simple past, but these two time tenses, they are the two most difficult ones in my opinion, because they have some exceptions. They work in a slightly different way than the other 10 time tenses. The other 10 time tenses, they are always the same. They are always the same structure. You never have to change anything about them. But the simple present and the simple past, you have to consider some things. So it says, the simple present and the simple past require some extra attention, because the fact that even though they are the first ones that we normally check, they are probably the two most difficult ones, because they have different rules and exceptions that the other 10 tenses don't have. Okay, what I was telling you. They have two very distinctive rules. There are two rules for the simple present and the simple past that are only for the simple present and the simple past, and we have to remember them because they are going to be useful forever. Number one, they normally don't use auxiliaries when we use them for affirmative statements. So this is important. They don't use auxiliaries. Sorry, this one is very solid. Okay, they don't use auxiliaries for affirmative statements. When you're using the simple present and the simple past, and you're using an affirmative statement, you don't use the auxiliary. Yeah, if you don't have the auxiliary, not having the auxiliaries sometimes affects the verb. Yeah, if you don't have the auxiliary, the verb is going to have to change. So that makes it a little bit harder. The second rule: the auxiliaries the auxiliaries work for every verb. So we have the auxiliaries for the simple present is do or does. For the simple past is did, and they are used for every single verb: jump, try, eat, feel, think, see, watch, eat, sleep, whatever you want. But there is one verb that is an exception. There is one verb that you never, ever, ever use the auxiliaries with. There is one exception: the verb to be. The verb to be in the simple present and in the simple past works in a different way. In the other 10 tenses, the verb to be is just another regular verb. It's a normal verb. You do whatever, it is normal. You don't have to take any special considerations. But in the simple past and in the simple present, the verb to be is a little complicated. So we're gonna start checking. We're gonna start speaking about the simple present. Okay, well, it says simple present and simple past. Let's remember the structure for affirmative statements. Okay, whenever you're making an affirmative statement, what you're doing is that you have your subject. This is the first thing that. Sorry, I need to connect this thing. Okay, so when you're making an affirmative statement, you always start with the subject, the auxiliary, the verb, and the complement. I hope you remember this. This is the structure for every sentence in English, any time tense, yeah? Except in the simple present and in the simple past, the auxiliary is not used in affirmative statements. What happens if you want to make a negative statement? You start with your subject, yes. The auxiliary is not optional, it's mandatory. Why? Because it takes the negative, right? After that, you have the verb, and then you have the complement. The complement is always optional, so if you want to use it, that's perfect. If you don't have anything else to say, that's perfect. How do you make a question? Very simple. You change the subject and the auxiliary. They change positions. You start with the auxiliary. And the auxiliary again is mandatory. It's not optional. It's not something that you do if you want. Then you have the subject, the verb, and again, the complement. If you want to make an information question, you start with your question word, and the rest remains the same. We were saying before that the parentheses around the auxiliary means that sometimes said auxiliary is optional. So only in the simple present, and simple past don't use auxiliaries and affirmative statements. Are you good? Remember, if this is an affirmative statement, you don't use the auxiliary. But if this is a negative statement, the auxiliary is mandatory. If this is a question, the auxiliary is mandatory. Okay, so this is very, very important. This part, you should write it in your notebook. You have to remember this part. Okay, this is going to be very, very, very important. Okay, so we're going to move on a little bit. We're going to start with the simple present and the auxiliary do. We have two auxiliaries for the simple present. We have the auxiliary do, and also we have the auxiliary does. Right now, we're going to check only do. When do you use the auxiliary do? The auxiliary for the simple present is do. When the subject is the first and the second person of the singular, the first, the second, or the third person if on the plural. Okay, so as you remember, we had something called personal pronouns. You remember the personal pronouns. They are the people, they are the persons that are the subject, and you can replace the person. Instead of saying Carlos or Jose or Johnny or whatever, you can say he or she or I. The first person of the singular is I. The second person of the singular is you. The third person of the singular, it says when the subject is the first and the second person of the singular, the third is different. For the plurals, we have the first person, the second person, and the third person. The first person is we, the second person is you, and the third person is they. In all of these cases, you use the auxiliary do, 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 and do. When do you use does? Okay, we're gonna check it in the next slide, but I can tell you that does is only for the third person of the singular. When you have he, she, or it, the auxiliary is not do, is does. Okay, so in this case, for example, we have affirmative statements: subject, auxiliary, verb, and complement. Subject, the first person of the singular. The auxiliary for the first person of the singular is do. The verb is just the verb in the normal form. You don't really have to conjugate it or anything. And then you have the complement. In this case, sorry, the complement is an object. Is just the thing that you are eating. I do the action of liking, and the pizza receives the action of being liked. This is the simple present. Normally, you don't use the auxiliary in affirmative statements. You don't say I do like pizza, you say I like pizza. Maybe you have a question and maybe you're thinking, can I use do? Can I say I do like pizza? Like, is it okay to use the auxiliary in affirmatives? The answer is yes, but you have to be very careful. 99% of the time, you never use the auxiliary. When do you use the auxiliary? You use the auxiliary in affirmatives only when you want to make emphasis that this sentence is affirmative. For example, I say something like, I like dogs. I like dogs. And you say, I don't believe you. You don't like dogs. And I tell you, yes, I do like dogs. When I say I do like dogs, I am making it affirmative or extra affirmative, okay? It is like in weddings. I don't know if you have seen a scene from a movie in English, when people get married, when they go to a wedding and they are in the process, and then the priest or the officer, whatever the person is marrying them, he says, person, do you take this person as your wife? Blah, 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 blah. And what is the answer? The answer is, I do. Why I do? It is, I do take. No, the answer would be yes, but yes is like very dry. Do you take this person as your wife? Yes. Okay, it doesn't sound very convincing. You don't say, yes, I take, because take is the verb. You say, yes, I do. This is the auxiliary for the present, and you're making it extra affirmative. Okay, so again, you don't use try not to use the auxiliary. You only say, I like pizza. The only reason to use the auxiliary is if you want to make extra emphasis on the fact that this is an affirmative statement. If somebody is challenging you, if somebody doesn't believe you, then you make this affirmation, okay? I do like pizza. Now, what happens if you have a negative statement? If you have a negative statement, remember the auxiliary is mandatory, it's not optional, it's not if you want. So you have subject, the auxiliary takes the negative. So it is super important, it is mandatory, it is not optional. The verb and the complement, okay? You don't like pizza. Are you good? You like pizza, you don't like pizza. That's pretty much it. You never say you not like pizza. Why you never say this? Because you have your subject, you have your verb, and you have your complement. But if you want to make a negative statement, you need the auxiliary taking the negative, and not is not an auxiliary. You need to say do not like pizza, or the contraction don't like pizza. Sorry, I think I misplaced this. I don't like pizza. Okay, so it is very important that the auxiliary takes the negative, and the auxiliary is mandatory. It's not optional. It's not whether you want or not. It is always like this. Yeah. What happens again if you want to make a yes no question? What is a yes no question? I hope you remember this from the first or the second class. A yes no question is a question which answer is only yes or no. Are you hungry? Yes or no. Do you want this? Yes or no. Those are the only possible answers. The answer is always yes, or the answer is always no. Okay, so how does it work? We have the auxiliary first and the subject second. We inverted the order. So we started with the auxiliary, which is mandatory. Okay, again, you always have to use the auxiliary when you're making questions. It is not optional. We have the subject, it is the doer of the action. We have the verb, and we have a complement. In this case, the complement is an object, is the thing or the person receiving the action of being liked. Do we like pizza? Yes, we do, or no, we don't. Okay, those are the only two possible answers. What happens with information questions? Well, the order is the same. Yeah, auxiliary, subject, verb, and complement. Auxiliary, subject, verb, and complement. The only difference is that you start with a question word. The auxiliary is mandatory, again. The subject, because you have the subject they, the auxiliary is do. If the subject was he, she, or it wouldn't be do, it would be does. Okay? Then you have the verb, and then you have the complement. The only difference is that you started with a question word. We have multiple different question words. We have why, when, what, how many, how much, how often. Depending on the question word that you're using is the type of information that you're going to receive. When you ask the question why, you're asking for the reason. So the person has to say because blah, 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 blah. They have to give you the reason. It depends on the question word. If you start with when, they are going to tell you the time. If you start with who, they are going to tell you the subject, so you wouldn't have the subject. If you ask where, they are going to tell you a place. If you ask why, they are going to tell you a reason. Okay? Again, question word, auxiliary is mandatory, subject, verb, and complement. So the only one that is different, that is really like special and weird and is behaving in a weird way is the affirmative statement. This is the only one that has like this weird rule about the auxiliary. The auxiliary is not used. In the rest of them, the auxiliary is mandatory, the auxiliary is mandatory, and the auxiliary is mandatory. So only in affirmative statements, we sometimes, or we try not to use the auxiliary, okay? The auxiliary for the simple present can be do or can be does. Let's remember a few things. When do you use do? You have them written here. I want to erase this part so that we have them clear when we move on. Remember that do is for the first, the second person of the singular, and all the plurals. So it is the most common one. You normally are going to be using the auxiliary do. Okay? So let me just finish erasing all of this. I don't want to erase this content in the middle. So, okay, that's it. Now, let's move on. And then we have the auxiliary thus. This is a different auxiliary, thus. When do we use thus? We use thus, sorry. I think all of this. We use thus, yeah, only here. We use thus in the third person of the singular. So we only use thus when the subject is he, she, or it. The rest of the persons, they always need do. It says, the auxiliary for the simple present is thus, only when the subject is the third person of the singular. This is the third person of the singular, this here. In the third person of the singular, he, she, or it, the auxiliary thus, if you don't have the auxiliary, like in the case on affirmative statements, the verb has to change and take the s. So this is one of the difficulties of the simple present. Let's check this part again. We have our subject. The auxiliary is normally not used in affirmative statements. We have the verb and we have the complement. Okay, we are not going to use the auxiliary. So if we don't use the auxiliary, if we don't have the auxiliary, what happens? Well, you have your subject. You don't have the auxiliary. The auxiliary was thus. The auxiliary has an s. If you don't have this auxiliary, the verb has to take this s. Yeah. In the other cases, in the first and the second, and on the first and the second person, it was do, so you didn't have to add an s. The s is only for the third person of the singular in affirmative statements because you don't have the auxiliary. If you don't have the auxiliary, then the verb has to change a little bit, and then you have your complement. Miguel likes pizza. Okay, can you say Miguel does like pizza? Well, two important things right here. Number one, if you do this, if you use does, you don't need the s. The only reason that you have an s here is because the auxiliary wasn't here. If you don't have the auxiliary, the verb has to take the s. The verb takes the s. If you have the auxiliary, the verb doesn't need to change. But remember, you never use the auxiliary. Only when you're emphasizing that this is affirmative. If you say something like, she likes to go to the cinema. No, that's not true. She doesn't like to go to the cinema. Yes, she does. She does like to go to the cinema. When you say she does like, you're making it extra affirmative. Again, 99% of the time, you're not gonna use the auxiliary. In classes, never use the auxiliary, because if you use the auxiliary, the teacher is going to believe that you're doing it just to avoid doing the rule, just because you're lazy and you don't want to do the rule. Okay, so don't do it. What happens in negative statements? Negative statements. We have subject, auxiliary with negative. The auxiliary takes the negative, verb, and complement. Remember, in this case, the auxiliary is mandatory. It's not optional. It's not if you want or if you don't want. It's mandatory. So you say, subject, Miguel, the auxiliary is thus. and it takes the negative. Remember that you never use only the negative. You need the auxiliary plus the negative. This is not correct. Miguel doesn't. When you have the auxiliary, this auxiliary has the S. Because you have this auxiliary here, you don't really need to change the verb. This verb doesn't need an S because you have the auxiliary. The only reason that this verb has an S is because you didn't have the auxiliary, okay? And then you have the complement. Miguel doesn't like pizza. When you make them negative, the auxiliary is taking the negative. The auxiliary is mandatory. And because you have the auxiliary, the verb doesn't have to take an S, okay? Let me repeat this part in Spanish because it is very important for you to understand it, okay? En el presente simple hay dos auxiliares. Está el auxiliar do y el auxiliar dos. Aquí tenemos cuando se usa do y cuando se usa dos. Si se dan cuenta, en casi todas las personas se usa do, en la primera, en la segunda persona del singular y en todos los plurales. El único momento donde se usa dos es en la tercera persona del singular, o sea, he, she or it. Esos son los únicos que usan dos. Estábamos viendo que las oraciones afirmativas en el presente simple y en el presente simple en este caso, son muy raras porque las oraciones afirmativas en el presente simple no usan el auxiliar. ¿Qué pasa si no usas el auxiliar? Bueno, pues no lo pones y ya. Pero en el caso de la tercera persona, si tú no pones dos, entonces el verbo se tiene que llevar esta S. Esta S que tenía aquí el dos ya no está porque no pusimos auxiliar. Entonces, ahora el verbo se tiene que hacer cargo de eso. ¿Qué pasa cuando lo hacemos negativo? Cuando lo hacemos negativo ya no tenemos ese problema porque tenemos nuestro sujeto, nuestro auxiliar ya está aquí y nuestro auxiliar tiene la S, el dos. Entonces el verbo ya no necesita volver a llevar S. Eso se llama doble presente y es simplemente redundante, no se necesita. Y esto de aquí es el complemento. Están en el mismo orden, solo que aquí el auxiliar es obligatorio. Aquí el auxiliar, como se dan cuenta, no lo pusimos. Nos dio flojera, lo quitamos, no lo pusimos. ¿Ok? Ahora, how do you make a question? How do you make a question? Let me just change this. Okay. So, when you're making a question, it is very simple. The only thing that you have to do is, again, the same thing. Subject and auxiliary, they change positions. You start with the auxiliary and then you have the subject. So you have first the auxiliary, then the subject, the verb, and the complement. Again, the auxiliary is mandatory, is not optional. So you have your auxiliary, thus. Because the auxiliary has an S, the verb doesn't need to have an S. This was only because we didn't have the auxiliary. When you have the auxiliary, you don't do this. Again, that is double present and that is redundant. It is not necessary. So you have your auxiliary, your subject, your verb, and your complement. Acuérdense que ustedes deciden si el auxiliar es do o dos dependiendo de quién es el sujeto. Si el sujeto es he, she, or it, el auxiliar es dos. Si el sujeto es I, you, we, you, they, o cualquier otro, entonces es do. ¿Estamos bien? Again, this is a yes-no question. The only possible answer for this is yes. Does Miguel like pizza? Yes, he does. Or no, he doesn't. Okay, these are the only two possible answers to this question. Again, you have auxiliary, subject, verb, and complement. But you want to make an information question. If you want to make an information question, the only thing that you have to do is start the question with a question word. Again, it depends on the question word. Si ustedes preguntan why, entonces esta información que les van a dar es el motivo. Si preguntan when, les van a decir el momento. Where, el lugar. How, el modo, etc. Depende de la pregunta que estén haciendo, el tipo de información que van a recibir. In this case, you have question word. Why? So you're asking for a reason. Auxiliary is mandatory in questions, is mandatory. Why is thus? Because Miguel is the subject and it is the third person of the singular. So the auxiliary is thus. Because you have the auxiliary and the auxiliary has an S, The verb doesn't need to have an S. It will be double present. It will be, again, redundant and unnecessary. And then we have the complement. So this is one of the problems of the simple present. ¿Ok? Hasta aquí lo que hemos visto del presente simple y por qué es tan complicado es que tiene varios problemas. Uno de ellos, de entrada, primero, el presente simple tiene dos auxiliares, do y dos. Y tenemos que saber cuándo se usa uno y cuándo se usa el otro. Y aquí ya vimos. Bueno, esa es la primera bronca del presente simple. ¿Qué otra bronca tiene el presente simple? El presente simple tiene más problemas. Perdón. El siguiente problema que tenemos es que las oraciones afirmativas nunca llevan al auxiliar. ¿Sí? Todas las demás sí llevan al auxiliar. Entonces, solo son las oraciones afirmativas las que son un problema. ¿Podemos poner el auxiliar en oraciones afirmativas? Sí, pero no lo hagan. No lo hagan a menos de que realmente tengan un motivo para enfatizar que la oración es afirmativa. Porque como maestro, si yo los veo haciendo esto sin ningún motivo, pienso que es solo porque les da flojera pensar en si lleva o no la S y nada más están ahorrando trabajo. Entonces, en las clases no lo hagan. Y si lo hacen, en cualquier motivo, en cualquier lugar, en cualquier escenario, tengan un buen motivo para hacerlo. No es nada más porque sí. ¿Sí? No se usa. Así, la regla general es no se usa. Cuando tenemos oraciones negativas, preguntas o preguntas de información, entonces el auxiliar es obligatorio. Cuando el auxiliar es obligatorio, el verbo ya no tiene por qué cambiar. De hecho, son más fáciles. El verbo va normal, como si fuera con do, ya no lleva la S, porque el auxiliar tiene la S. El único motivo por el que le ponemos S a los verbos es porque no hay sujeto. Perdón, no hay auxiliar. Porque no hay auxiliar y es la tercera persona del singular. Entonces, es muy sencillo. Si tienen el auxiliar, no necesitan cambiar el verbo. Es muy sencillo. Esto es el presente simple. Ahora, debimos empezar por aquí, creo. ¿Cuándo se usa el presente simple? ¿Para qué sirve? ¿Por qué el presente simple y no el presente continuo, el presente perfecto? ¿Qué quiere decir? ¿Cuándo escogen ustedes usar el presente simple? Pues el presente simple sirve para hablar de rutinas, de cosas que siempre son así, que siempre son ciertas o que normalmente son así. No sirve para hablar de en este preciso momento. En este preciso momento es el presente continuo. Lo vamos a ver más tarde. Pero en el presente simple es como, por ejemplo, a mí, yo me levanto a las 8. Si dices me levanto a las 8, es yo normalmente me levanto a las 8. No significa que hoy lo haya hecho. No significa que en este momento sean las 8 y esté en el proceso de levantarme. Significa que es mi rutina. Es lo que normalmente hago. ¿Qué haces? Normalmente, o bueno, sin el normalmente nada más, yo me levanto a las 8. ¿Sí? El cielo es azul. El cielo siempre es azul. Se utiliza para rutinas o para cosas que siempre son ciertas. Bueno, en la noche es negro, pero entienden a lo que me refiero. ¿Sí? Entonces, bueno, vamos a ver. Vamos a quitar aquí todo esto para pasar al siguiente problema del presente simple. El presente simple es un tanto complicado, es bastante complicado porque, bueno, tiene más de un problema. ¿Cuál es el otro problema del presente simple? El otro problema del presente simple es que el auxiliar do o does funciona para todos los verbos, excepto para uno, el verbo to be. Okay? So it says, another problem with the simple present is that the auxiliaries do or does, they work with every common verb, such as like, run, go, think, dream, and even do. For example, in this case, you have do, you do. Auxiliary, subject, verb, and complement. Parece que está repetido, pero en realidad este está cumpliendo la función de ser el auxiliar, está diciéndote que la oración está en presente, y este de acá está cumpliendo la función de ser el verbo, te está diciendo cuál es la acción. ¿Haces tu tarea? Normalmente, tú haces tu tarea. Incluso el verbo do funciona con el auxiliar do. I don't do, yo no hago. Pueden decirlo perfectamente. Parece repetido, pero acuérdense que tenemos que pensar en funciones. Uno está funcionando como el auxiliar y el otro está funcionando como el verbo. Tienen dos funciones diferentes. Por eso no están repetidos. No se trata de qué palabra sea, sino de qué función está cumpliendo. Pero el verbo to be no funciona ni con do ni con does. No se puede. El verbo to be juega aparte. El verbo to be, it has conjugations. It has 3 different conjugations. In the singular, first person, I am. You don't say, I do am. No. I don't am. No, 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 no. You never use the auxiliary. So you say, I am. For the third person of the singular, he, she, it, is always is. He is, she is, it is. For the rest of them, the second person of the singular and all the plurals is always are. You are, we are, you are, they are. So it can be am, are, or is. These are the three possibilities that we have. The verb to be in the present has three different conjugations. Am, are, or is. Okay? So far so good? Okay, so let's move on. Let's explain how this works. It says when we are using the verb to be in the simple present, we will never use the auxiliary. The verb is going to take those attributes. So normally, in a normal sentence, you have your subject, in a normal sentence, you have your subject, yeah? You have your auxiliary, you have your verb, and you have your complement. Normally, in the simple present, what we normally do, again, we have subject, auxiliary, verb, and complement. But remember that the simple present never uses the auxiliary. We normally never ever do that. So, okay, we don't have the auxiliary. You are hungry. That's perfect. Yeah? Subject, auxiliary, verb, and complement. Instead of you do are hungry, this is impossible to say. You say, you are hungry. This one is perfectly okay. Why are? Because the second person always uses are. If the person was he, then it will be he is hungry. If it was I am hungry. Remember, it has to be am, are, or is, depending on the subject. But what happens when you have what happens when you have a negative statement? Negative statements, normally you have your subject, the auxiliary takes the negative, you have your verb, and you have your complement. This will be okay in the simple future. This will be okay in the future perfect continuous. But the simple present is weird and it's difficult. In the simple present, again, we have this problem. We never, ever, ever use the auxiliary when you have negatives. Sorry, when you have the verb to be. The verb to be never, ever, ever uses the auxiliary. So what do? If you don't have the auxiliary to take the negative, then what happens? What happens is that the verb takes the negative. So you have, again, in this case, it will be your subject, and the verb to be, is taking the negative, is working, is taking the attributes of the auxiliary. And then you have your complement. You never, ever, ever, you never say, you don't are hungry. Do or does are never, ever used with the verb to be. This is the only exception. The verb to be is the only one that works differently. Okay? So, for example, what happens if you have a yes/no question? You start with the auxiliary first, the subject, the verb, and the complement. This is normal. This is what we normally will do. But again, the simple present never, when your verb is the verb to be, you never, ever, ever use the auxiliary. So what do you need to do? If you don't have your auxiliary, what do you need to do? The verb is going to change positions with the subject. If you don't have, you have them right here. If you don't have the auxiliary, remember that you need to invert the subject and the auxiliary. You don't start with the subject. So what do? What you do is your auxiliary is going to be the verb to be. So how does it look? The auxiliary is the verb. Then you have the subject, and you don't have a verb because the verb is at the beginning. What you have right here, let me just change it, is auxiliary, subject, You don't have a verb because the verb is acting like the auxiliary and then your complement. Yeah, you never ever ever say, do you are happy? You never ask these questions because the verb to be never uses the auxiliary do. What do? You take the auxiliary and you switch it with the subject. Are you happy? Are you hungry? Are we okay? Finally, we have this. It's pretty much the same thing. Information question, you start with your question word, auxiliary, subject, verb, and complement. Super easy. But again, the problem is that this sentence is completely different. When you are using the verb to be, you never, ever, ever use the auxiliary do or the auxiliary does. So what do you need to do if you don't have the auxiliary? The verb is going to switch positions with the subject. Okay? So again, right here, let's do this part. If you don't have the auxiliary, yeah, you normally will have it, but if you don't have it, this verb is going to act like the auxiliary. So you have a different thing. You have question word, auxiliary, subject. You don't have a verb because the verb and the auxiliary are the same, and you have a complement. So you have, this is not the auxiliary. Question word, auxiliary, subject. You don't have the verb because the verb moved to be the auxiliary. It's taking the attributes of the auxiliary, and then you have your complement. You never ask, why do you are here? You never ask this question. When you're using the verb to be, you never, ever, ever use the auxiliary do or does. What do you need to do? The verb is going to take the attributes of the auxiliary. And you say, why are you hungry? Or why are you here? This is the problem with the simple present. Okay? The simple present has multiple problems. Vamos a repasarlos una vez más. Primero hay dos auxiliares. Está el auxiliar do y está el auxiliar does. Ese es un problema. Segundo, bueno, tenemos que identificar cuándo se usa un auxiliar y cuándo el otro. La tercera persona del singular utiliza does, todos los demás utilizan do. Hasta ahí estamos bien. Esa fue la primera dificultad, ya la pasamos. La segunda dificultad es que las oraciones afirmativas no usan el auxiliar o normalmente no usan el auxiliar. Casi nunca lo usan. ¿Y qué pasa si no tienes el auxiliar? Si no tienes el auxiliar, pues no pasa nada, excepto si es la tercera persona. Porque si el auxiliar era does y lo quitaste, quitaste la S. Esa S se la tienes que poner al verbo. He likes. Como no puedes decir he does like, entonces dices he likes y ya continúas. Cuando las oraciones son negativas o preguntas, ya sea de sí o no o de información, el auxiliar es obligatorio, no es opcional. Siempre dices, does he like, why does he like, he doesn't like. Cuando tienes el auxiliar does o do, entonces el verbo ya no tiene que cambiar. El único motivo por el que le poníamos una S al verbo era porque no había un auxiliar. Si tenemos auxiliar, nos libramos de eso. Estamos perfectamente bien. Ahora, nuestro segundo problema. El segundo problema del presente simple es que el verbo to do, bueno, el auxiliar do o does, funcionan con todos los verbos, incluso con el propio verbo do, excepto con uno, el verbo to be. El verbo to be funciona de otra manera. El verbo to be nunca, ni en afirmativos, ni en negativos, ni en preguntas, va a usar el auxiliar. Nunca usa do y nunca usa does. ¿Qué es lo que hace? Que el propio verbo to be funciona como si fuera su auxiliar. ¿Sí? El propio verbo to be es el que va a funcionar como auxiliar. Es el que se va a llevar los negativos, es el que va a cambiar su posición con el sujeto para hacer preguntas. Y el verbo to be en presente tiene 3 conjugaciones: am, are or is, dependiendo del sujeto. La primera persona del singular, I am. La tercera persona del singular, he, she, it, is. Y todas las demás son con are. ¿Sí? You are, we are, they are. Así es como funciona más o menos, ¿sí? ¿Para qué se usa el presente simple? Se utiliza para hablar de rutinas o de cosas que siempre son ciertas. Este es uno de los 12 tiempos, más los modales, más los semimodales, más la voz pasiva, más otro montón de cosas que vamos a ver. Pero este es uno de los 12 tiempos y este ya tendrían que saberlo. Estamos en quinto, sexto semestre, por lo menos en cuarto, todavía no estoy seguro para qué semestre estoy grabando esto, pero esto es algo que viene desde primero y es más, viene desde la secundaria, desde la primaria, a veces desde el kinder estamos con el do y con el dos. Entonces esta parte tiene que quedar muy clara, esta parte es muy, muy importante. ¿Ok? En el siguiente video vamos a hablar del pasado simple, que tiene muchas similitudes con el presente simple. Tanto el pasado simple como el presente simple, pónganlos aparte, porque estos dos son raros y diferentes. Nos vamos a dar cuenta después cómo los otros 10 tiempos son mucho más sencillos. ¿Ok? Entonces, bueno, si tienen alguna pregunta, si tienen alguna cuestión específica, traten de apuntarla, traten de tenerla en mente, me la pueden mandar por mensaje, podemos ir checando aquí mismo en los comentarios del video, o también podemos directamente hacer ejemplos específicos cuando tengamos una reunión interactiva. ¿Ok? Entonces, bueno, eso sería todo por ahora. Cuídense mucho y nos vemos luego.